monitor the chat, that would be awesome.
I will be keeping an eye on that. I'm sure Colin will too.
Today we're going to talk about part 4 of the series that Crystal and I have been doing over this past year-ish. General tips and tricks for the beginning developer, and we're focusing today on VBA. Crystal has built this wonderful index, which maybe she can demo when it's her turn here. I'm going to cover just a few items here about VBA. The first thing that I want to talk about is user-defined functions. So for user-defined functions, if you define a function in a module, here I have a module that I've created called VBA demo, and I've created a function in there and I've made it public. I do some things like this periodically. You know, VBA has a lot of built-in functions that do fantastic things, but if you want something that it doesn't do, you can create your own. And the advantage of doing that in VBA and making that public is that you can then use it in other places. You can use it in things like queries. You can use it within the builder and access it, the ... if you're trying to build something. You can use it as a control source in a text field. This particular one that I built gets the current Sunday from my date. So if I was to run it right now, just from the immediate window, it would get you the 26th. Today's the 28th, but it goes backwards until the date is a weekday equal to 1, and it decrements before that and then sets that to current Sunday. Functions like that are useful if someone has, for example, a reporting system that they want and they want it to run Sunday to Sunday or something like that. So I might use that, a function like that, to compute what the previous Sunday would be. So it's not complicated, but the fact that it's a public function means that you can use it in places like a query. You can say that the past Sunday equals current Sunday, left paren, right paren, and run something like this, and you would get the current Sunday here, or past Sunday rather, as a computed field in the query. You can also do things with functions by actually using them in a form. For example, this one I think I did it on. So in the detail event here, on the double click event, I called a function. This function happens to be in this form. So let's take a look at the form itself and the code. Before I did this, it had double click events for order date. So if you double clicked on the order date field of that form, it would run this code. Or if you double clicked on the order ID, it also ran code. Well, that code was the same thing. So what I did was made a function. This one happens to be a private function, but I'm calling it only from within that form. So if I call this function from an event equal open order detail form, end of parenthesis, left parentheses, right parentheses, it runs the code in there. Now you can't do that with a command, with the subroutine, but you could use a function to call a subroutine. So in this case, it's on the event on double click for the detail. So if I open up this form here and I double click on any of the places of the details, it runs that function and opens up the details for that particular order. That one's 71, this one's 84. I clicked in a different, anywhere in the detail, it does that. So user-defined functions are very cool VBA, very powerful VBA usage. Another thing you can do is to reuse code in VBA. An example here in the active orders, where instead of having to have the same code multiple times, you put all the code in one spot. Now, why is that helpful? If you have to make a change to the code, then you don't have to make it in multiple places. Then you only have to make it in one spot. You can take your code and put it in a subroutine, a private sub or a public sub, depending upon what you're going to use. Here we have a routine called set default shipping address. And then if you search for this here in the module, set default shipping address, you'll find that that's used after the customer ID is updated. It's used, you could use it in other places too, within the same form, and then all the code would be in one spot. And then you could call that from this, you could call it, this one happens to call for SetFormState, so maybe that's a better example. It's called there, 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 and here's the subroutine. So instead of putting all this code in, what was that, 5, 6 places, you just make a subroutine in VBA to run that. So then there's some common reasons to use VBA. In a form, if you're going to process a button click, for example, in this form, you can have a macro which processes a button click, but you could also write VBA code to process the button click event. And you can use VBA code, for example, to open a message box, to display some kind of information or warning. You can use it to customize your form. In that, we just looked at the SetFormState, and the SetFormState actually enabled specific controls depending on certain criteria, and it locked certain controls depending upon certain criteria. So that's one example of customizing your form, and depending upon what the criteria was at certain times, your form will actually operate differently. You can also use it to refresh combo boxes. For example, this reporting combo form has several fields on it. Here you select sales report, and here is different sales items. Well, on this form control after update event, there is code after the update, then it initializes the filter items. And the filter items is this one down here. This is the filter items. So it actually sets this data source according to what you select in this list box. So here it sets the row source of that item, and it actually looks it up in a table, but it filters it based on the value of the sales report that you chose. So if we take a look at the runtime for this, here, this filter sales item, what shows up there depends upon which one of these you have selected. So like this one's USA, this one's different categories instead of countries, this one's employees. So that's all done with VBA behind the scenes on the after update event by just calling a couple lines of code. Were you trying to talk, Crystal, about the macro bit and converting?
Yes.
Okay, good. I thought that I was, but I saw that on your list. Okay. Then the last thing I want to talk about before we hand it over to Crystal, who has a lot of slides for you today, are variables. Variables in VBA can take several forms. One way that I typically do global variables is by putting them in a module up at the top of the module and naming them. then instead of using the dim key like you would within a function typically, if you, or a subroutine to define your variable, if you use the public, then that variable will be accessible by all your forms and all your code. Another way to do the same thing, or close to the same thing, is to use the TempVars. But don't let TempVars fool you. They're called TempVars, but they're global in scope, which means that if you create a TempVar, whether it's in a macro or whether it's in VBA code, whether it's in a form or a module, if you create it, and you can create it by either using this TempVars add or just setting, like naming the TempVar and setting the value. So you can do it either way. Either way works the same. Once you do that, then that TempVar holds that value and anything globally can access it. The one advantage of using TempVars over a public variable like this is if you do a reset in VBA, or if you've got an error message and you hit end code, I think is what it says, then these global variables lose their value. TempVars do not until you close the access session. Here's how you can remove temp variables if you want to remove them, either with individually by the remove command and then the variable name, or you can remove all of them with this remove all command. Then we also have local variables, which are using just the dim command. So if you use a dim within a function, the dmyDate variable that's in this function, the scope of that is it's only visible within this function while you are running it. If you were running some other subroutine or code in the same module, nope, you could not. dmyDate would act like it wasn't set at all, which would either throw you an error depending upon your settings here with option explicit, or it would give a default value of, depending upon the type of variable, 0 or null or whatever. If you declare it at the top of a either module or form and you use dim instead of public, then the scope is that module or form. So you could use it within routines within that section, either module or form, and see that, but you wouldn't be able to use it from outside if you have dim instead of public. And by the way, the word global and public are interchangeable in statements for declaration. Global is the old way of doing that. We now use the word public instead. But if you see the word global variable name as string or whatever, that is the same thing as public. And then one more type of variable is called static. And what a static variable does is it retains its value, but it still has the same scope as the other. So if we switch dim here to static, then that's still the scope of that is still within this function. But if you had it set to Sunday and you didn't have this item here, or maybe you had this item or a test to see if it's set up, and if so, set some kind of starting date or something like that, and then you exited the function and then you came back in later, that static variable would still have the same value that it had previously. So I hope that makes some sense. Variables are very powerful, but it's important to understand what type of variables you're using and the scope of them. So that's all I have, unless there was any specific questions about those items.
A couple of things were raised.
Okay.
When you talked about the resetting the values of public or global variables, it is only the reset, not the pause or break that
that is correct.
said.
Yep.
I have a
Not to
question
worry.
here.
The break just pauses the code,
I beg
but
your pardon,
it's
sorry.
actual reset.
Dwayne asked, do TempVars support arrays? Crystal's answered, I believe not. Can you confirm that?
Whether you can use arrays in TempVars?
No, they're not complex at all.
I don't think so
Was
either.
that the question?
That was the question. I just wanted to make sure that, although it's been answered in the text, I wanted to make sure it was raised so that everyone who perhaps isn't watching the text so closely will be aware of that. So obviously aware of the answer as well as just the question.
Right.
So far as I know, only numbers, dates, and text.
I think you're right, George. I don't use them myself, but I'm from what's been said, I'm pretty sure you're right.
And I can verify that while Crystal's
He's doing the other stuff.
doing that. I actually, my style is not to use TempVars, but if you've used macros, you may be more used to them, and they are very powerful in the case that if you're worried about your code ending someplace, or some kind of end happening to VBA running, they do preserve the value for that. So I'm not sure if I talked about LocalVars instead of global. That's something that you can use. Typically it's used within a macro.
Sorry, is there what you're saying, there's a predefined collection called LocalVars?
I think it's LocalVars.
I'm only aware of using LocalVars in macros.
That's their typical usage. The difference between using TempVars and LocalVars and macros is the TempVars, if you set up a TempVar in a macro, the value of that at the end of whatever macro you are running is retained, and that can be used in another macro. You don't have to redeclare it and reset it. It retains its value. So TempVars are actually global variables. LocalVars are not. They would be local only to that macro.
I see them as a disadvantage in one sense. The fact they keep their value means that I may not actually be aware of an issue in my code that I need to fix. And as a developer, I'd rather actually be aware of losing the value so I can actually go through and find out what the problem is and fix it. So it's just a different point of view. I'm also a bit too old in a way to have got to use TempVars much. I use them occasionally, but still it's the minority of the time.
The only thing I don't really like about them is their name, right? To me,
That's true.
Temp means scope is temporary.
Yeah, temporary for that session, which means it's permanent. Yeah.
I was going to say it is actually temporary to the session.
To the session, yes, but that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yes, and to explain, especially to people, your current audience today. I do have more questions from the chat, if I may just catch up. Robert Barden asked, can you reference TempVars directly in queries? And the answer to that is yes. It's often used that way. Static means it's maintained between calls. Colin made his comment directly in queries. Thanks, George. TempVars can be used directly in queries, but global varies cannot, unless reference.
That is true, and that is another advantage of TempVars.
That's why I started using them. In fact, I actually did a presentation. I will see if I can find the reference. It should be in the Access User Group video YouTube collection. Using TempVars in queries. I'll see if I can.
That's the title of that.
I will go look. I can't remember right off the top of my head where it is.
If there's nothing else urgent, I think we'll let Crystal go ahead.
Thank you, Maria. It's good to be here with you and everybody else. Okay.
There we go.
I'm going to go through these really fast. I have a ton of slides. I'm only going to talk about macros really lightly, but they are a good first step to VBA. And the macro actions, when you go to a new macro or you go to a macro, you have an action list. There's almost 100 items if you show all the actions. Now on the macro design, all the actions aren't showing by default. You have to actually ask to see them all. Here's just a simple little macro This is just everybody's first macro. It might be just a simple message box. And when you go into the macro designer, it prompts you for the items that you can fill out. And a message box is no good without a message, so that has to be filled out. The other items are optional. When you run the message box, it just says the message. The title is My Message Box. After you kind of get your feet wet with macros, it's a good idea to just convert all those macros to VBA. So if you have a standalone macro, you can just go to the Macro Design ribbon tab and convert macros to Visual Basic, and it'll make modules for you. Now we're going to actually go into Visual Basic. Maria went in a little, and I'm going to just back up and do something really simple. Now I already did it, so I have my edit toolbar showing. Under View, you can go to Toolbars, and you can turn on the edit toolbar. You can move it around. I really like showing this because I comment and uncomment a lot. So here I'm just going to comment all those lines at once. A comment starts with a single quote, and then anything on the line is green. So as you start typing, I'm just going to make a subroutine. And now what am I going to call it? The two basic types of procedures you'll create are subs and functions. I'm just going to make a subroutine. The next thing is, what's it going to be called? This is just going to be Hello World. I like to press Tab key to indent the line. Message box. Now notice I'm just typing all in lowercase because I know Access will recognize that. Hello World. And this is just now a very simple procedure, and you can correct the spelling. Access won't care. To run it now, under Debug, you always want to compile everything first and then save. And now under the Run menu, we can choose to run. You can also press the F5 key. So I'm just going to click in here and press F5, and this is not a very impressive program. It just says Hello World. If I want to create a similar program, I'm going to make another thing with a message box. And now I'm going to take this line, I'm just moving slightly to the left of it and clicking, and I got the whole line selected. Let go, drag this down, but before I let go of the mouse, I'm going to press the Control key down. And notice, I don't know if you can tell, the mouse has a little plus next to it. So when I let go, it drags a copy. This message box, I'm going to say the current date and time is, this is the literal part of the message. It's enclosed in quotes. And now I'm just going to add on the results from the now function. So here again, debug, compile, save it, click in here, press the F5 key. This is my current date and time, Central Time. So other people in other parts of the world, it'll be different. All of this code is contained in a module sheet. I said I'd show you a macro. Go into the design view of this macro, turn off that action catalog because it hides a lot of stuff. But here, when you choose an action, you can pick what you want, which action you want. Real common ones are open form, open report, stuff like that. And then you'll get prompted with the parameters. So I'll just close that. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint presentation. So that was just kind of a quick demo. References, and you can download this slide deck. I apologize, but I am going to go through this really fast. I wrote like the first 3 chapters of a book about VBA. There is a link there, so you can go grab that book. If you want to see VBA code with a lot of comments, I have a lot posted on MsAccessGurus.com in the code section. A couple years ago, Maria gave a presentation. That would be a good reference. That's a real long link. I put Maria's slides in my presentation, so it's all here in this one. So code is stored in a module. A module is a container for VBA code. Mostly what you'll see is functions and subroutines. Now functions return a value, like adding things. You want to get the sum of something. And you might think subroutines don't return values because you don't, like, say the return data type is this, but they can because they can change parameters, and I'll show you that in a minute. If you have a form and the form has macros, you can just convert all of those macros, whether they're embedded or standalone, to VBA behind the form. Just go to the design view of the form and convert macros to Visual Basic. You can also put a Convert Macros to Visual Basic button on your Quick Access Toolbar. If you want to know about customizing the Quick Access Toolbar, I made a little video about that, and you can also download my Quick Access Toolbar. When you convert a macro to VBA, the wizard is really old and it adds error handling, and it used to be that line labels all had to have different names in a whole module. Well, now line labels just have to have different names in a procedure. So what I often do if I convert something with the wizard is I'll just go and generalize then those line labels.
Well, and I might just add here that converting existing macros that you've written is a great way to get started with VBA, because in my opinion, it's easier to understand it than it is to write it from fresh. So if you already have an example of a macro and you want to get started learning VBA, that's a great way to start.
That's a great point. And I do encourage people to start out with macros. I mean, don't just not start. Start with macros. I know everybody puts them down, but, you know, we all started somewhere. So this is just the little sub that I wrote with HelloWorld. After HelloWorld, there are open close parentheses. There's nothing in there because this doesn't have any parameters. The MessageBox does have parameters, and you have to have a message. In this case, the parameters aren't enclosed in parentheses because we're not handling a return value, and OK is the only choice in the MessageBox. If, for instance, we want to do like a yes/no thing, like here, I have a message box. Do you like the weather today? And your choices are yes or no. I want to know, what did the user click on? If I want to handle the return value, then I need to have parentheses around the arguments for MessageBox. And here I'm just doing a select case, and MessageBox then, because it's got the parentheses around it, is going to return which button was clicked. Another thing I did right here is I use line continuation. See at the end the space underscore, because it's kind of good to keep all the statement on the same screen. So line continuation, I use it a lot, and it's really easy to add in. And then you can wrap one statement onto several lines. Kind of a refresher on data types. These are the data types for fields when we define a table. Minimum, the maximum, the type declaration, the size. The data types in VBA are pretty much the same. There's more data types. This is just the simple ones. Except in VBA, yes, no is called Boolean. And all text in VBA is string. And strings can be really long. I was going to try and tell you how long they can be, but maybe one of you guys that's connected knows that, and you can put it in the chat. What is the limit for a string in VBA? Does anybody know? When you're writing code, You need to have some way to keep track of values so you can use them. And Maria talked about variables. Variables have to start with an alphabetical character, and they can't contain periods or type declaration characters, spaces, or other illegal characters. I think it's good just to always start them with a letter, and if you have a number in it, just don't put that number first. To declare a variable, you can use the dim statement, dimension, dim varname as type, like dim smessage as string. A real common mistake is not to explicitly define each variable type. See that line in red? What's wrong with it? The problem is that sname is not specified. You might think that both of those are string, but no, sname is going to be a variant then. Variants are a special type of data. They're actually have two parts, one to keep track of what data type is, and the other lets you put all kinds of things in there. Variants can also hold null. Parameters are variables that are defined in parentheses following a procedure declaration. So for instance, this is a real simple function. We're going to sum numbers and we're going to send it the two numbers that we want to add. The reason why they're defined as variants in the parameters is because they could be currency. They could be single precision. They could be long integer. We don't really know what the data type is. When they're done, it's going to return a double precision number. When you are declaring parameters, by default, they're passed by reference. And what that means is that the value of that can be changed by the function or the sub. And then when it's done, it's going to pass that changed value back. If you don't want that to happen, you can specify ByVal. For instance, get birthday, PDOB as date, that's by reference. And then here's an optional parameter, ByValue, with a specific date as of, like if you're doing a tournament, you want to make sure everybody's at least 16 by the time the tournament starts. You can use this to figure it out. And now this other optional parameter, it's going to actually return the age, but it's not going to do it as the return of the function. It's going to do it because it's going to modify the PI return age variable in the code. And then after you call this function, then whatever you sent for that placeholder, you can test it and that'll be the years old. Scope refers to where a variable is known. So it could be the current procedure, the current module, the current project. If it's defined in a procedure, it kind of is where it's defined and also how it's defined. You can explicitly declare a variable to be public or private. And private my variable as string is actually the same thing as dim my variable as string. If you want something to be public, so it's known all throughout the project, you can preface it with the word public. If it's in a class module, there are still things you have to do to reference it. But if it's in a standard module, you can run it from anywhere. Behind a form, here we have a close button, and we're defining a click event. Access put in the private sub command close click and the end sub. So what's between that is then what is going to happen. And by default, anything in a class module, like code behind a form, is prefaced with private. If I wanted to run this sub from somewhere else, I would need to change private to public. This is a public procedure behind a form, and it was done as public because I want to be able to run it from other places. Maria said you can define a global variable at the top, and global is the old word, public is the new word. So if you aren't using them yet, just use public and forget about using global. They both are the same. Another way to handle variables, like, okay, so here I'm just showing how to set and assign and get global variables. TempVars, Maria talked about TempVars. They do get lost when the database is closed, which is why I like database properties. The database already has properties like the startup form, application title, if special keys are on or off. You can also set custom properties, and they are remembered even when the database is open and closed again. So I have a link there to a module you can download for handling properties. Basically, you can create a property like this, CurrentDb, although it is better to make a object variable called db and use db and then set db to nothing when you're done, because using CurrentDb a lot can really make you get extra connections that you don't need. You can set it, you can change it, you can get it. Here's a user-defined function. All right, Excel has this nice function which I like. It's called floor. Access doesn't have that. So I just made a function called GetFloor, and I'll show you. I put it in a query. Here's the SQL for a query. I'm going to get the floor based on 10, based on 100, and based on 1,000. And so you can see that what it does with the first line, 4,553. If it goes down by tens, it's 4,550. If it goes down by hundreds, it's 4,500, or by thousands, it's 4,000. I'm just going to go back up here. See that column with double numbers? I actually made all those numbers up by running this function, GetRandomDouble, and the source of that was just a table of numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so on. The first parameter is just a dummy. It's not actually used. Had to do that so that it actually evaluates it every time, because if you don't send some sort of a field or something that changes, it'll only do it once, and every record in the query will have the same value. Kind of useless. Here's a summary of operators. We have our standard arithmetic operators. There's 2 ways to divide, and we've got mod. This is, you can just refer to this later on. Now, when you are in the integrated development environment in VBA, we've got different windows. We've got the Project Explorer, the Properties window. We've got the Code window, Immediate window. If you go under the View menu, you can turn these various windows on and off. The Locals window shows you what the values are of your information, and you can see pluses and minuses, so you can expand and collapse it. Then you have a watch window, which lets you watch particular variables, and you can see what the value is. Now, if you break code while it's running, the call stack shows you what called something, which called something else. The edit toolbar, I really, really love. I showed you that right in the beginning. I did the comment. It also has an uncomment block. I use those more than any other buttons, I think, when I'm in VBA. Here's how to turn it on. A property is just a characteristic of something. So a characteristic of a form is its name, or a characteristic of a field is its name, or its data type. It's just a set value. Now, a method is an action. So if you have a form, forms can do things. They can open, they can load, they can close. So those are actions. A collection is a set of related objects. All of the fields in a table, for instance, are a collection. The object browser, and I'm going to go back to VBA for just a minute because I just love the object browser. I'm going to just press the F2 key. Here, I'll just start by going to the VBA library. And now I'll close this space up a little bit. This is a wonderful reference. I want to convert something. Here's all the conversion functions. I want to do something with math. Here's my math functions. I almost call those trig functions though. I want to do something with text, or I want to do something with a date time. So you can look up the various functions. You can change this to access. Where's my mouse? Where did it go? Use the keyboard to pick you. All right, now let's say I want to find out about a record set. So here I just typed R, I clicked in the classes column, and record sets in DAO, not access. Got to go down one more. Go to record set, and here are different properties and actions that record sets can do. So now I'll go back to the PowerPoint, and on the options to set your defaults, kind of like the dashboard of your car, how comfortable are you getting around? I just did a screenshot of the dialog boxes here for you, so you can look later and then say, oh yeah, I saw that somewhere. Where was it? Now, one thing I definitely usually uncheck is auto syntax check on the editor, and I always require variable declaration, and I change tab width to 3 instead of 4. I've kind of captured what my settings are, and you can do what you want. At the top of a module, we have compiler directives, and they tell the compiler how they should interpret statements. So for instance, all access databases say option compare database at the top, all the modules. And what does that mean? It has to do with how strings are going to be compared. Now another one I like to add is option explicit to require variable declaration. There's an option base, so if you use arrays, by default the array will be 0 based, but you can change it to be 1 based or whatever number you want. Declarations are non-executable code, so they're very important because they declare something, but they're not executable statements. Like an API declaration. Oh, is Peter here? Peter took an exception. Oh, this is slide 49. Peter, you said you didn't like this one. Do you want to turn your mic on and tell me why?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, the Win64, you don't need that. If you are, well, that code there, that would run in 32 or 64-bit. If you have updated the declarations to use long PTR where required, then you also don't need the Win64 because it will adjust automatically the variable to 32-bit if it's running on a 32-bit office, and 64-bit if it's running on 64-bit. So only in, I think it's 13 out of 1,500 odd declarations do you actually need that Win64 compiler directive.
Well, thank you, Peter. Peter gave an excellent presentation on converting API calls to 64 bits, and you too can go watch it. The link is in the video description, also at the top of this slide. Colin said the API is like the black boxes, and we just get them to work, don't we?
Yes, we
Yes.
do, but I'm agreeing with Peter. You don't need the Win64 compilation section there at all.
Just to
Okay.
simplify, sorry, Crystal, just to simplify, if you look at the code after the hash Win64 and then the code after hash else, you'll see, as far as I can see, it's exactly the same.
But that wouldn't be the case always, Adrian.
No, but in this, that's what,
Yeah.
in other cases you might need it, but in this case,
they're identical there, so in a way it's a bad example. But if you had an example where there was a long pointer used, it would still work whether you had 32-bit or 64-bit access, as long as it was VBA 7. In other words, as long as it was 2010 or later.
That's
Well,
right.
thanks, guys. Yeah, I don't know it all. I've still got a lot to learn. I did want to mention classes. You can also have a class module. Now, you can make standalone class modules, like, for instance, to define behavior for controls, and then different forms can subscribe to that. Code behind forms and reports is in class modules. And now we have a bunch of shortcut keys. I'm just going to put these on my other screen for a minute, and I'm going to show you some of my favorites, shortcut keys for code. When you're going through code, you can press Control down arrow, and you just jump up and down one procedure at a time. This is kind of a quick way to go through things. I really love the Control G, which gets you to the immediate window. And you can drag this around. Let me try and have it not be quite so big. Have to make it smaller first and then drag it. And here's where I can just ask it questions. What's now? This gives me the current date and time. I can give it any expression and have it evaluate it. I guess the one I actually do use the most is the tab key. Tab indents code, and Shift tab decreases the indent. You can also select several lines and press the tab key or Shift tab to increase or decrease indent on several lines. I won't go through the rest of the shortcuts. You can just see which ones you like the best. At the top, you can use these as a quick way to find code. This has all the code by name alphabetically. Now, if you're in code behind a form, you can drop this down and it has all the controls that are on that form. So let's see, command addresses. What kind of code do I have on that? I have the click event button. Okay. If you drop this list on the right, what's defined will be bold-faced. I know you probably can't see, but click is actually in bold. Or if you go to the very top of a module in code behind a form, and you drop the list of what's declared, what you'll see is what's declared that's not attached to a control. If I'm actually in this code down here and I drop this list, I'm just going to see what other things that have to do with form. But if I want to quickly find something that I wrote that isn't attached to a control, I'll press Control Home to go to the top, drop this down, and then the code that I want to go to.
Crystal,
Yes.
can I just mention about using the right click and using definition? If you've got some
yeah, good point.
call something or other. You had it earlier, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah.
There we go. Call
Yeah,
filter.
yeah, like filter me. Oh, excellent. I do this a lot too, is right click on it, like Colin said, and go to the definition. That's a really quick way to find it. Well, in that case, it was right after it, but yeah, that's usually not the case.
It will work even if it's in a different module.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, absolutely.
If you're in a different module and you were like, golly, I don't remember where I was when I went to the definition, you right click again and use that last position. It takes you back to where you were when you right clicked into the definition. I love that feature too.
Right. That's a really good one also. Let me come up here where we can't see filter me. I guess we can see it all that time. We'll put some space in here. Go down and I'm going to right click, go to the definition. And now what Maria was saying was, oh, where did I just come from? I can right click and go to last position. Or what is it? Shift Control F2. What's that shortcut key?
Adrian says Shift F2 is definition. So Control Shift F2
Yeah,
goes to last position.
Yeah, one of them. Maybe it's on my shortcut key thing. It is.
Crystal, it's Shift F2
F2.
for definition. Crystal, Shift
Yeah.
F2 for definition and Control Shift F2 to return. And Robert has posted that in the chat.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Robert. This is just a little bit about me. I have videos on YouTube. I post code tools and articles on MS Access Gurus. I have stuff on accessmvp.com also. I'm not very big about posting in forums like I used to be, but I still love to go to forums, and I certainly look things up on them a lot. That's it. I'm done.
Crystal, that's amazing. It is 1 o'clock exactly. I never thought you would get through 54 slides. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you. On Tuesday, the 25th of January, Maria will present the Access Connector for Dataverse and Power Platform.
It'll be the last Tuesday in January. I thank everybody for joining us today. If you want to hang out and chat and ask questions, I think Crystal and maybe Adrian are going to stick around for a while. I'm visiting with family for the holidays, so I'm going to leave the meeting, but I'll leave it running for a while, and you guys can stay on and chat.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Yep.
On Tuesday, February 8th, Colin Riddington will present his popular automatic form resizing tool to the UK Access User Group.
Dwayne made a very good point about naming functions and not, whatever you do, using the same function name as the module name. Otherwise, it won't work.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's worth stressing to everyone at this point in case I haven't read it.
Yeah, I've answered a number of questions on the user groups or the forums, and it's like bottom line is that they've done that, and the error message doesn't always tell you exactly what's going on, but it happens.
On
Not often.
the naming of functions, if you name a new function the same as an existing one, doesn't the operation just work on the new one and leave the old one unused?
I think it depends where it is. It will work on the local function if it's within, for example, in a form. If you name a function the same as you've got it in a module, it will still use the form function. But if you've got two different module functions, I have no idea what will happen.
You've got a standard module. I don't think it allows you to give a procedure the same name as a procedure in the same or another standard module, as long as they're both defined as public. If you do them public or global, the compiler will complain. If you've got a class module which includes all the objects, forms, reports, etc., they're all class modules. If you define something, then that will take precedence within that over the same name of a public procedure defined in a standard module. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's what I was getting at. I was experimenting with MessageBox. There's an enhanced MessageBox written by a Cyprus Lookout, and he uses a slightly different name. But in my testing, I just changed the name of his function to MessageBox, and then it was using the new one and ignoring the built-in.
I would imagine if you put your own MessageBox function in a standard module, then it would be globally available within your project, and it would then use that instead of the standard MessageBox function.
Right.
You know, in another place where names have to be unique, and I got bit by this during a presentation. I've never done it, except I did it then because I was copying and pasting too much, but the project name has to be unique. And I did a paste and I called it the same thing as a module, and of course it didn't work. I didn't figure it out right away though.
So you mean really that you created a module and named it the same as the project?
Well, what I did was I changed the project name to the same as a module. Yeah.
Essentially, you've got, the thing is that the modules are all within the project.
Right,
So
exactly. And they also can't be the same name as the project, which I found out the hard way.
what today was about, and I thought was done really quite well actually, was exposing so many of the different things that are available. Didn't go into a lot of detail, but I've posted the link for everybody that Crystal has of her PowerPoint presentation where all the slides are. So everything that she's covered very briefly is in there and possibly in a bit more detail. But so many different possibilities were covered, and I was actually quite impressed with that. Nice one, Crystal. It was great to get so many things covered and, as you say, exposed as available so that people know to look for them if they're ever working on stuff. Oh look, yeah, Crystal mentioned that in a thing, albeit very briefly.
Thank you.
Colin mentioned that if you add two integer values and the sum exceeds the integer limit, you'll get an overflow error. That is obviously true. CurrentDb, what wasn't made clear, and a lot of people don't even understand and realize, is that CurrentDb is the return of a function. So CurrentDb is actually a function call, which returns a DAO database object. People often tend to use it, and you did warn about that, as if it's a database object. It's not exactly that. It's a function that returns that, and every time it's called, it reprocesses to create a new database object. So if you want to work with your one database object and use it consistently, then you don't want to keep calling the function. You want to have a variable set. You set the variable to CurrentDb or some other, and then you use that variable, and then it's consistent.
I agree with what Adrian's saying. I'll just point out that if, like me, you used to do it the wrong way and used to define it every single time, it adds additional processing time.
Colin, there are so many other problems with it than just the extra time.
That's true.
When you're using CurrentDB, if you put the parentheses afterwards, so CurrentDB open close parenthesis, it then makes it clear that it's a function call rather than a variable. Watch was discussed, and a watch is a brilliant thing, but what it can also do that wasn't covered is it allows you to break into your code under certain conditions. So when a variable or an expression, the result of an expression changes, you can tell the watch window to break into your code at that point. So I find that extremely powerful.
I like that too.
What else? Oh yeah, control page up and control page down are very good ways of going from one procedure to the next in your code. Same as up and down arrow, but they stop at a different point. Peter put some very helpful stuff in for bookmarks. Alt-E followed by B and T to toggle a bookmark. Alt-E followed by B and P, Papa, to go to previous, and obviously Alt-E, Bravo, November to go to the next. Colin wanted to know how you learn all these obscure shortcuts, time with it, experience, playing with it, and getting Crystal to give you her link of what all the shortcuts are. She's got a good set.
Peter taught me several shortcuts about 2 weeks ago, and Peter, I apologise for the fact I've already forgotten half of them. So I've got, I think, a limit in my capacity with shortcuts. Yours is obviously higher than mine.
The more you use them, the more you'll remember them. And Crystal's got a great slide. One of her slides is a list of what loads of them can do. And if you see one there, you think, oh, that would be handy to use without having to use the mouse and all right click and all that nonsense, then you can easily get into the habit of using them. Dwayne, good to see you, mate.
Happy New Year, Dwayne.
Yep. Bye-bye.
See ya.
Bye now, Dwayne. Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
This is really helpful to kind of fill in my general knowledge. So yeah, greatly appreciated.
Same here, Russ here. And I dabble in VBA, but I'm not, proficient as you guys are. And that's what I said, I'll rewatch this YouTube video and try to pick up. I really like that idea of multiple options when the questions. I guess I would go just no or a message box. That's it. That's about my limit there. So.
Yep. You have to remember, Russell, very few people are as accomplished as we are.
Thanks also for sharing the PowerPoint, Crystal. Much appreciate all of your work that you share with us.
Very good point, Charles. That's got loads of stuff in it, that PowerPoint presentations.
Thank you, Crystal. That was wonderful.
Yeah,
Thank you, Colin.
This was a good one.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Have a nice new year. Cheers, everybody. Bye now.
Cheers, Colin.
And thank you to
Right.
Crystal particularly. Bye.
Have a great New Year's.
And you.
Indeed.
Bye.
Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for the presentation, Crystal. I was Happy New Year, Leo. Closed a lot of stuff quickly.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, Crystal. Cheerio, Peter.